Welcome, Gunrunner.
Coin-op conversions have become a real staple of home consoles since the arrival of the Atari 2600 in 1977. It was the arrival of the first so-called killer app in the Atari 2600 port of Taito's Space Invaders that very much emphasised the importance of arcade ports and saw all the big companies fighting to acquire the latest cabs, often before they were even released. But alongside all the official arcade ports and the unofficial clones that were created to cash in on the success of these coin guzzlers were a select group of games that sit in a rather grey area in between. Games that were very much supposed to be ports of classic coin-ops, but for whatever reason fell through the cracks and never made it out in their intended form. So in this video I'm going to be taking a look at those games, the titles that once carried a big name license but eventually found an audience under an alternative moniker. It will be interesting to see how many of these you were even aware of as we go through the list, so when we get to the end make sure you let me know in the comments. Now without further ado, here's the story of 5 games that were supposed to be coin-op conversions.
Astrocade, the professional video game system that gives you 4-player capability, 3 built-in games, a calculator, and these new cartridges. Creative Crayon. Even the young can make beautiful pictures. The Incredible Wizard has a dungeon of surprises for you. You can even create your own games with Astrocade Basic, the easy computer teaching cartridge. Astrocade, the home entertainment sensation that's a personal computer too.
In 1977, Atari outdid their big arcade rivals Midway Manufacturing by releasing a home console in the form of the video computer system. The Chicago-based company looked on with envious eyes and decided to use their own arcade hardware to create a console of their own that would be technically superior to what became known as the Atari 2600. Fulfilling their objective, just a year later they released the Bally Professional Arcade, later renamed the Astrocade, a very cool looking console that bested its existing rival in almost every area. Just as Atari were doing with their own console, Bally Midway set about converting all their most popular arcade games to their own home system. We soon saw titles like Datsun 280 Zap, Seawolf and Amazing Maze appear on the Astrocade, but the best was yet to come, as Midway also started bringing arcade games over from Japan, signing licensing deals with both Taito and Namco. This saw Midway handle the North American releases of huge hits like Pac-Man, Galaxian and of course Space Invaders, which brought massive success to the company. However, despite ports of all these games and more, the Astrocade was struggling to get any kind of grip on the market, losing out to the aforementioned Atari 2600 as well as the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and the newly released Mattel Intellivision. The Astrocade ended up being a victim of Midway's huge arcade success, as the company chose to give it up to focus on where their profits were really being made, and sold the Astrocade console onto a newly formed company called Astrovision. The big problem with this was that the new company would have to pay Midway to license all the coin-op conversions available for the console, so the names of several existing games had to be changed. For example, Space Zap became Space Fortress, Pac-Man became Muncher, and Space Invaders became Astro Battle. But there was one more cartridge that hadn't yet been released. A port of the hit Midway arcade game Wizard of War. It was an incredibly impressive conversion too that put the arrival Atari 2600 attempt to shame. But not willing to pay for the license, Astrovision were forced to rename it The Incredible Wizard. Unfortunately, this excellent game did nothing to change around the fortunes of the Astrocade, and it became one of the first victims of the North American video game crash in 1983, putting Astrovision into bankruptcy. One of the big success stories of the early 80s when it came to video games was Coleco Industries. Starting off with their tabletop LCD games and standalone consoles like the Telstar, they launched the ColecoVision to expectant audiences in August 1982. Whilst all their early efforts were spent trying to one-up their big rivals in Atari and Mattel, Coleco soon made the decision to capitalise further on the big name licences they had acquired like Donkey Kong, Zaxxon and Smurf, and released them for other consoles besides their own. Initially releasing games for both the Atari 2600 and Mattel Intellivision, Coleco soon turned their eye to the rapidly growing home computer market, specifically the Atari 400-800 and Commodore 64. Indeed, Coleco even entered this sector themselves, with the failed Adam computer, but that's a story for another day. One of the company's big name licenses for 1983 was a conversion of the popular Sega arcade game Turbo, and it was chosen as one of the very first Coleco titles to appear on home micros. Unfortunately for Coleco, there was even bigger news than this in 1983, the arrival of the much discussed North American video game crash. Coleco ended up being one of the worst affected companies when it came to this crash, and it saw them exit the video game industry completely and return to focusing on toys. With this, all upcoming games were cancelled, including all the third-party releases of Turbo. Simon Leck, the programmer of both the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64 ports, was rather miffed with this. He had a finished game on his hands and no publisher to take it off him, so he put them in a drawer for several years and forgot about them completely. Then in 1987 he saw an advert in a magazine by a company called Atlantis Software, who were based in the UK and were looking for games to publish on their budget label. A very quick name change later, and his conversions of Sega's Turbo became a new game called Death Race, and Atlantis asked him if he could convert them into a tape image. He duly delivered, and Atlantis was so impressed with his work that they managed to persuade him to create two new and original Atari 8-bit games for the company in the form of Crack Up and Cops and Robbers. Interestingly, Atlantis liked the game so much that they also got him to convert it over to the Commodore 16 computer for them too. In 1983, Atari surprised many people by setting up the Atari Soft label to bring some of their biggest hits to rival platforms too. As the market leaders at this time, they really had no need to diversify and make their rivals' consoles and computers seem more attractive, but the story goes that acquiring licenses like Pac-Man, E.T. and Mario Brothers had become so expensive that parent company Warner Brothers wanted to recoup some of this. As well as releasing games for North American systems, Atari surprised us once again by setting up another branch for Atari Soft in the UK to develop games for the popular home computer formats in that market too, like the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and BBC Micro. We soon saw ports of games like Robotron 2084, Pac-Man, Moon Patrol and Pole Position announced for these formats, and the initial releases were very well received in the UK, with this looking like a lucrative market for them. But in the wake of the North American video game crash, Warner decided to sell the debt-laden consumer division of Atari to Jack Tramiel, and he soon set about a vast restructuring of the company's many assets. One of the first to get the chop was Atari Soft. He saw no benefit in supporting his rivals and wanted all focus to be drawn to Atari's own projects, like the upcoming ST computer and rebranded XE machines. This left a huge amount of Atari Soft games unreleased. Some of these cancelled conversions were picked up by other companies. For example, Quicksilver licensed and released to the ports of Battlezone, and US Gold did the same with the conversions of Crystal Castles. But there were many others that totally fell by the wayside. This was mainly because they were IP that wasn't originally owned by Atari, so it would now require two lots of licensing, Atari Corporation for the code and the original owner for the game itself. However, some people did manage to find ways around this by rebranding these titles as clones. Probably the best example of this is the BBC Micro port of the Williams Electronics arcade game Sinistar. Programmed by the legendary Peter Johnson, the code was acquired by Superior Software, who already had quite the reputation for releasing clones of popular arcade games for the BBC, like Killer Gorilla and Missile Strike, and promptly released the game to enormous acclaim. What's also interesting is that Superior Software published an official BBC Micro port of Tempest, so no doubt did a deal with Atari Corporation to make all this possible. Another interesting point of note related to this was that Atari Soft's BBC Micro port of another Williams Electronics arcade game in Joust also made it out the door, being picked up by Godax for release in 1988, where it was renamed Skirmish. Now, you've probably noticed that all the entries that I've included so far were victims of the North American video game crash that ended up being saved. And here is another. In 1980, innovative California-based arcade manufacturer Exidy released Targ, a very cool variation on the much-used maze game formula that seemed to have been largely forgotten, which is no doubt in part due to its lack of home conversions. But that really shouldn't be the case, because this highly underrated coin-op was actually picked up for porting by leading software publisher CBS Electronics. Numerous home conversions of the game were planned, including the Atari 2600, ColecoVision, Commodore 64 and Atari 8-bit, but not a single one of them made it out the door, despite their appearance in various catalogues. CBS cancelled all upcoming releases during the maelstrom of the aforementioned crash, and Targ was one of the most high-profile candidates, sadly. Fast forward about 5 years, and in 1988 mail-order game specialist Teddy Games struck a deal to re-release all of M Network's Atari 2600 titles under their own label. They had been experiencing a resurgence of interest in Atari 2600 cartridges, mainly due to the release of the rebranded Atari 2600 Junior and backwards compatible Atari 7800 consoles. They were starting to run out of inventory and saw a chance to capitalise on the demand by publishing games of their own. Alongside the re-releases of M Network games like Deadly Discs, Burger Time and Bump and Jump were several reissues of other games like Zonox's Chuck Norris Super Kicks, renamed Kung Fu Super Kicks to avoid paying Mr. Norris any money, and Sunrise Software's Quest for Quintana Roo, as well as some original titles like Glacier Patrol and Universal Chaos. Or so it seemed anyway, because both of those were in fact official releases of previously unreleased games. Glacier Patrol was simply a game that Sunrise planned to release before they merged with Telegames, but Universal Chaos was a lot more interesting. That's because it was in fact the Atari 2600 port of Targ, with some minor alterations. Besides the different enemy graphics and slightly different sound effects, the screen changes colour with each level, and the names have been changed in the manual. This can all be verified by playing the dumped prototype of Targ. As well as the 2600 version, a seemingly complete prototype of the Atari 8-bit version has also been found and preserved for everyone to play on the internet too. In 1981, the newly formed Japanese branch of Commodore International were looking at designing a new games console to compete with the recently released Epoch CassetteVision and Atari 2600. Despite the company's existing focus being computers like the PET and VIC-20, they felt these new lower-cost all-in-one game boxes could make a real impact in the market, and also felt that Commodore had the technology to outdo all the competition. Lead engineer Yashi Terakura wanted to leverage the design of the advanced new Commodore 64 computer, which was still in the prototype stage, to do this, and set about developing what would become known as the Commodore Max. But the big bosses at Commodore knew that if they were going to break the Japanese market, they would need some big-name arcade titles to entice their potential audience. So they soon struck deals with both Namco in Japan and Midway in North America to bring some of their hottest titles to the VIC-20, Max Machine and Commodore 64. The three big-name games that Commodore licensed from Namco were Galaxian, Rally X and Pac-Man, and it wasn't long before they had them ready for release. However, they soon hit a huge snag that had somehow been glossed over when they signed the original deal. Not only did the Namco license have a limited timescale, but it also didn't include any rights outside of Japan, as they had been sold separately, and rather ironically, it was Commodore's other arcade partner Midway that had made the astute acquisition for their home territory. This left Commodore with a pretty large conundrum. The systems were struggling to make any impact on the Japanese market, and there was no way that they were going to recoup their expensive investment on the Namco license. So the decision was made to rebrand all the games. So Galaxian became Star Battle, Pac-Man became Jelly Monsters, and Rally X morphed into Radar Rat Race. The latter of these is undoubtedly the most beloved of these all, however, because it also appeared on the Commodore 64 as well as the VIC-20 and became a real cult classic for the computer. But take a closer look at that gameplay on the screen, and its arcade origins are pretty easy to see.
A day in the life of a Commodore 64. Commodore 64. Once you get it, you'll wonder how you got along without it.
And that completes my deep dive into 5 games that were supposed to be coin-op conversions. Are there any others you can think of that should have made the list? Or have you played these titles and noticed any important differences to the arcade originals that I didn't mention? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons to continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Grady Haynes, Dee Vaughan, Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Ozzy B, Dos Gamerman and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host-restricted content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.